We're going to get started here with our first debate, and I'm going to ask Ann to introduce the two debaters. And the idea here is this is an Oxford-style debate with no slides. Both presenters will have 6 minutes and then 1 minute for rebuttals. And Ann, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. It is such a good meeting that we can't pull our speakers up. It really is. It's a phenomenal meeting. I'm always impressed every year how well this is organized. So it is my great pleasure to be moderating this debate on DTC advertising. I want to introduce first Dr. Rita Redberg, a cardiologist and professor of medicine at UCSF, has been seeing patients for over 40 years. After growing up in Brooklyn, she graduated from Cornell University and the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. She holds a Master of Science in Health Policy and Administration from the London School of Economics. Dr. Redberg was the chief editor of JAMA Internal Medicine from 2009 to 2023 and spearheaded the journal's new focus on less is more medicine. Dr. Redberg had previously served on the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, as well as on the Medicare Evidence Development and Coverage Advisory Committee as chairperson. She is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. Tomas Philipson is the Daniel Levin Professor of Public Policy Studies Emeritus at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy and has a well-rounded expertise in business, government, and academia. He is considered an expert in U.S. economic policy, particularly healthcare policy, serves on several corporate boards, is an active investor, and has co-founded several companies, including Precision Health Economics, LLC, with an exit in 2015. Tomas has served in several public sector positions. He served in the second Bush administration as senior economic advisor to the FDA commissioner and subsequently as senior economic advisor to head of the Centers for Medicare and Medicare Services. He was previously vice chairman and then acting chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Tomas received his MA and PhD in economics from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and he has been a visiting faculty member at Yale and a visiting senior fellow at the World Bank. I am very excited to have both of our panelists. Let's start with you, Dr. Redberg.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we can all agree that our goal is to get credible information to patients that can help them make better informed healthcare decisions that will hopefully improve their health and lead to even possibly longer life. I think what we're here to debate is the proposition that direct-to-consumer advertising is the best way to do that. And I'm here to explain to you why direct-to-consumer advertising is not the best way to do that. In fact, it's not advantageous at all because it doesn't offer credible, accurate, and balanced information. As we, I believe, could all agree, advertising's purpose is to sell a product. The advertising is not designed to be balanced, it's not designed to be complete, it's not designed to be accurate. It's designed to sell a product. In this case, we're talking about medical products, drugs, and devices. I'll quote from Franz Engelfinger, former editor of New England Journal from 1972, which is actually before direct-to-consumer advertising was allowed by the FDA, when he said, "Advertisements should be overtly recognized for what they are, an unabashed attempt to get someone to buy something, although some useful information may be provided in the process." He suggested advertising should be divested of its pseudo-educational character. And that's really the problems with direct-to-consumer advertising. It's not balanced. It consistently overemphasizes the harms and overestimates the benefits and underestimates the harms. And in fact, I think all of you, if you've watched direct-to-consumer ads, and as they are ubiquitous, I'm sure everyone in this audience has seen some, even the way the harms are presented is designed to be misleading. As you hear somebody reading in a very nice voice the list of the serious adverse events, which include perhaps fatal blood infections, severe dyscrasias, you see on the screen couples that are frolicking on the beach or walking hand in hand with their dog while this person is reading serious adverse events. So it is not designed to actually inform. It's designed to sell a product, and that is what it does, and it's incredibly successful at that. So we know in the last 20 years, according to multiple studies, including some by Steve Woloshin and others by Aaron Kesselheim, who's here today and we'll hear from later on another topic, the number of direct-to-consumer ads at that 2016 had increased 5-fold, and the increase in spend has gone into hundreds of millions and increased exponentially. And industry is not, they're a for-profit business, and they're doing that because it sells product. The problem is the product itself is not necessarily what is best for patients. I am definitely in favor of information for patients, but I think, as I said, it has to be accurate, it has to be balanced, and it has to be unbiased. And so when you have information coming from a conflicted source, you get the problems I'm talking about. In another study led by Patel, Huang, Woloshin, and Kesselheim again, that was published in JAMA Network Open last year, they looked very laboriously at 20 years of direct-to-consumer advertising, and they found that 71% of the drugs that were advertised in direct-to-consumer ads were of low therapeutic value, and that was determined by 2 different credible independent sources not related to the authors. And so it's not that you're seeing high-value drugs being promoted generally in these direct-to-consumer ads. And in fact, one would say if they were so great, you wouldn't need to have advertising. They would sell themselves on the benefits. Another big problem with direct-to-consumer advertising is it doesn't talk about the alternatives. Because it is from one manufacturer for one product, it tells you about that product. It doesn't tell you if there are other drugs or even non-pharmacologic alternatives that are as effective or maybe even better. Because it's an ad, it's not balanced information. Another issue with direct-to-consumer advertising is that it tends to medicalize everyday problems. And so we see the usual aches and pains that everyone has as we go through life, particularly as we get older. But when you look at ads, fatigue, aches and pains, you're told that this could be the symptom of some deadly illness and you should go to your doctor. And of course, it's because then the idea is to sell you on some high-priced medication, or not even high-priced, but one you didn't need at all, in order to solve a problem that would have never been a problem in the first place if not for the direct-to-consumer advertising. And so that's another issue, and again, studies have shown that direct-to-consumer ads have tended to increase anxiety, increase patient questions, but not about things that are beneficial to their health. That's the real question. Are we making patients better off? And sadly, the data shows that direct-to-consumer advertising is certainly very profitable for the industry. It has been attributed to the many faceted problem of increasing drug prices, but certainly ads have contributed. I just learned during the break here that these direct-to-consumer advertising expenses are actually tax deductible for the companies, which I find remarkable. And I also note, there's been years of research now because we've had direct-to-consumer ads for over 25 years. In 2005, Kravitz, Mitchell Feldman, and others published in JAMA looking at what kinds of prescriptions were being promoted with direct-to-consumer advertising. And sadly, it was frequently not prescriptions for appropriate indications, but rather prescriptions of inappropriate medicines, medicines that people weren't going to be better off with. And so I think their other approach for getting information is to have it from a unbiased source that will present fairly the risks and the benefits for drugs, for devices, for whatever we're looking at. There have been many proposals.
I'm going to interrupt really quickly. We're going to move to time. Do you want to wrap up really fast?
Yeah, I'm going to wrap up. So the proposal was for drug fact boxes, but from an independent source, one-page, very readable information. The FDA has recently proposed patient benefit information, another kind of one-pager. There are alternatives, not from biased sources. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Dr. Philipson on the pro side.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to argue that probably what's needed here is going to be actually affecting this debate, because I don't think Rita or I could win this debate, because if you wanted to settle this debate, I think you needed systematic evidence on the cost and benefits of DTC, not anecdotes that, some proponents say it's highly beneficial, people against it say it's highly disadvantageous, etc. But basically, broad systematic evidence on the benefits and costs. I obviously believe if such a study was done, I believe the benefits would swamp the cost, but I don't think that study's out there. I'm going to take probably an even more controversial stand for this audience, which will argue that DTC for prescription drugs is probably is the most acceptable form of direct-to-consumer advertising compared to many, many other industries. So what do I think is the benefits and costs of DTC? So obviously the benefits is just simple product awareness. If you look at DTC spending for prescription drugs, they're pretty much about 60% occurs at launch. So they're trying to get the word out that this new drug exists, etc. Now, that's sort of the most obvious effect, and I think it's going to dominate any negative effects. But there's a more subtle reason why DTC is great. And that is that the patients are many times experts compared to the doctors on the individual or private treatment effects of the drugs advertised. There's no accident that the drugs advertised are chronic conditions that are symptomatic. And for those conditions, the patients have a lifelong history with the disease and understands many times if the treatment is working much better than the doctor. Say depression. The patient understands depression a lot better than the doctor for himself. Not an average treatment effects, but the private treatment effects. Erectile dysfunction, presumably the patient understands that better. Arthritis, pain is very subjective, and the patients probably understand how different treatments affect their pain a lot better, etc. So I think there's a lot of stuff that the patients, because of heterogeneous treatment effects, the patients understand their own individual treatment effects better than doctors and the scientific community who are focused on average or median effects in the population. So it's not sort of an accident that we go after the experts in chronic and symptomatic diseases to get the information to them, essentially. The cost of DTC, I think, mainly comes down to, so there's underconsumption that gets solved by launch and advertising, making product awareness, like any other industry. It's not unique to drugs. The cost is that there's overconsumption. The argument is that there's overconsumption that basically for unsafe or ineffective drugs. There's 4 mechanisms in my view that basically limits that problem dramatically. This is a consumer market unlike any other market where you need an expert to authorize that you consume the product, namely a doctor. So basically you can't get a handle on the product unless an expert approves that you actually get a handle on it. Second, there's not only a third party, a fourth party called FDA that mandates that the seller has sufficient information on the product quality in terms of effectiveness and safety before it actually can go on the market. Thirdly, there's product liability that greatly penalizes companies for marketing ineffective and unsafe drugs. And lastly, but most importantly, there's FDA and FTC regulations that you can only market on-label information, essentially, that the government has run the quality evidence on and says it's actually safe and effective. So I can't think of any other industry where there's as much consumer protection against misleading information from sellers compared to prescription drugs. Maybe you can. But assumably, we're not against advertising for every industry. I assume the opponent is not against advertising. It's always biased towards benefits and downplays costs, but there's competition that is always biased towards costs and downplays benefits. And that's, you see ads essentially saying why they're better than the existing treatment when they come on the market, essentially. So I think that's not something unique. Lastly, I think the argument against DTC that I hear many times is that it reduces R&D spending. If they would just spend all this marketing money on R&D instead, wouldn't we be better off? That's a non-economical argument, because essentially increased marketing raises R&D spending. It doesn't reduce it. The reason it raises R&D spending is because it makes the market larger, and when you make the market larger, people at the JPM conference tomorrow will spend more in their VC and PE funds in funding the clinical trials, essentially. So if you don't permit the market to be large, you won't have as much funding of the trials. So those are the two arguments, I think, against the cost.
Thank you. Dr. Redberg, you want to respond?
I would love to. Thanks so much. I appreciate the points, but I would say it's incumbent on the proponents of direct-to-consumer advertising to do the research to show its benefits. I have a stack, and this is just a small sample of articles that show the problems with direct-to-consumer advertising, which I've talked to you about. The very careful reviews of years of direct-to-consumer ads that show that they tend to advertise low therapeutic value drugs, that they tend to be set up to purposely confuse patients and not present balanced information. In fact, an FDA survey itself showed that patients were more likely to be confused by ads, that they used incomplete lists of harms. They did not give any quantitative information on harms, while they sometimes gave quantitative information on benefits. And the studies I've also shared about the ads tending to advertise low therapeutic value drugs, not the ones that really work for patients, and not to discuss alternatives. So I would welcome research from direct-to-consumer advertising proponents, but haven't seen any. And evidently my opponent hasn't either. I would say that I think the FDA does have the responsibility to regulate advertising, but it is overwhelmed and the office is very small, and they do not review ads before they go to public, go to print, or whatever media they're in, which is, again, confusing and not known by most consumers. There have been lots of surveys. There was a recent Harvard Health letter from Dr. Schmerling that summarized some of the problems with direct-to-consumer advertising, which we have talked about, but to summarize, they raise costs. There has been clear evidence showing that they lead to increased drug costs, and they're not related to the value of the drug. They're related to the marketing efforts. They tend to create disease and medicalize symptoms. Patients certainly know their pains better than anyone else, but what they don't know and don't learn from the ad is which pains are serious, which pains you should seek medical care for, and which are your, everyday pains that are going to go away in a few days on their own. And the ads tend to promote new drugs, in particular, as my opponent just said, and that means that there is no long-term safety data. I remember clearly attending conferences in the 90s to talk about women and heart disease in primary care settings, and these conferences were sponsored by Purdue Pharma, and their main marketing message was that OxyContin was safe and effective and could be prescribed by anyone. So that's just one example of the problems with direct-to-consumer advertising. It was a huge problem, and as we know, it turned out not to be true, but it's been hundreds of thousands of very sad and preventable deaths later.
Okay, let me move on to Dr. Philipson.
Yeah, so I think I have a different view of how a market operates than my opponent. If you sell a product that is great news, because that means the customers values the product more than the price they pay. I don't think patients are fooled with a chronic decision into consuming a particular drug, that they stick with this drug for a very long time, etc., and they're doing huge mistakes in over-consuming the drug. I think people understand their health very well, and they're very, very aware of side effects and effectiveness of whatever drug they're consuming. I think the fact that this is sort of centered on chronic diseases with symptoms makes this point more salient, because people are living with these diseases, and the fact that you can sort of fool them into taking a drug, I think is very, very misleading. On the evidence on the benefits dominating the cost, I haven't done the study. A simple study that could be done is to take the thousands of people that switch therapies when a new therapy comes out with DTC, and to stick to that therapy, presumably for good reasons, or to that drug, I should say, presumably for good reasons. Those numbers are just going to swamp any kind of anecdotes of bad behavior or misinformation, etc., because there's millions of people who are benefiting from learning that there's a new treatment for their disease that's better than the standard of care. I think it would be extremely easy to do a study that takes the number of, the companies essentially market this drug because they know the patients will stick to it. They don't spend big marketing budgets unless it's going to change demand. So if you think that demand is completely misguided, then you live in a different world, I think, than the patients with these chronic diseases.
Excellent. I would love, there's two things next. I would love, if anyone has questions, please come up to the mic. Feel free to ask a question. Second, I would love to assess here how many people are on the pro side of DTC advertising. Raise your hand. And how many are on the no side? Interesting. And how many believe that there is probably a compromise in between the two? Very interesting. So I have to just put my own opinion.
Can I ask another question?
What did you say?
Can I ask another question?
Oh, sure.
How many people are against advertising in any industry? There you go. Thank you.
Well, there was only one.
I would just note that healthcare is very different because we hide the prices, we hide the data, and it's not a free market.
Healthcare is different in that the consumer understands exactly what's going on a lot better than other products.
Well, so let me say. So I have someone who has a little bit gotten into some hot water on this. I have some thoughts. And it's actually quite interesting. The FDA does have the Office of Prescription Drug Promotion, where there is actually quite a treasure trove of data that has been interesting to look at. And I do, as a direct-to-consumer company, I do feel like what has surprised me, and if you look at all of our FDA authorizations and the comprehension studies that we have, is that people are capable of understanding more in healthcare than we ever expect. That said, I think like any kind of advertising, when there's Fruit Loops on the TV, my kids suddenly want Fruit Loops. And no one is advertising the generic, healthy brand cereal that would be better for my kids to have. So I do think that consumers are hungry for information, but I do think like who is it who's advertising the highly effective generic antidepressants out there versus who is it that is promoting the branded drug that is new out there and has margin. So I do think that there's an element of distorted information. My dream world is actually to be able to help people understand, like when they do have a disease, like restless leg syndrome as an example of like, rather than having the drug, could you better help people understand the disease, what those symptoms are, when you potentially need to ask, and then are there resources that are more comprehensive that could help a person understand it? Because I do think that we see with our comprehension studies that people are far more capable of understanding the information than we expect. All right, we'll start over here.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Rita and Thomas. I think we're having the wrong debate. And let me tell you why I think we're having the wrong debate. We have a lot of new products that are coming over the counter. I mean, an early example is genomics. Now we have hearing aids. We have oral contraceptives. We must advertise these new products. There's no choice. But the problem is they're coming out in ways that don't let us advertise them in ways that will work. For example, hearing aids. You cannot get help from an audiologist to buy an over-the-counter hearing aid. You're on your own, and consumers, I am certain, cannot deal with it. So now we need to focus on how can we shape advertising so that it can really work. But I don't think we're going to have a choice because of all these new products.
You don't think people can tell if they can hear or not?
I can tell you from personal experience, I tried an over-the-counter hearing aid. I could not get anyone to help me. They don't work. $2,500 later, out of pocket.
That's not advertising. That's a product quality issue.
Well, no, if there'd been better advertising to help me choose the right product for me, I might have gotten the right one. Or you need a delivery system that will work with people to help them.
Yes. Okay, next question.
Thank you for this debate. I'm a physician innovator, and I've been in practice for 20 years. The gap between what's offered to patients and what's possible has gotten worse. So, no debates. I have real patients who need to know about these solutions. What's one recommendation each one of you would have to all the decision makers here that we can implement in a year to make this better? More information that's safer.
Sure. As I mentioned just very briefly as I was closing, probably almost 20 years ago, I think Steve Woloshin and Lisa Schwartz proposed drug fact boxes, and we also could have device fact boxes, but not from a conflicted or biased source, but it could even come, if the FDA had resources, the FDA itself, because they do very careful reviews of medications, and it's a box, so a very clearly written summary of the harms, the benefits, with quantitative information that patients can use. What did the studies look like? What was the quality of evidence, which is never discussed in an ad? All of that would go into a less than one-page drug fact box and be freely available with every prescription, and also could be designed for over-the-counter.
I come back to my argument. I polled the audience. No one is against advertising in other industries, which have much less consumer protection than prescription drugs and don't have government agencies clearing quality before you go on the market. And you can only market on that quality that's been cleared by the government agency, namely on-label marketing. You can't market it off-label. So I think, if you believe, I don't think it's consistent to believe we should have advertising in other industries and not have advertising in an industry that's much more protective of the patient or customer.
Unfortunately, we have done a great job of generating debate, but we have to move on. We're about to be taken over by the next panel. Appreciate it, and feel free to find the panelists and ask in the next break.
Thank you so much. Great.